see what we got.
Have you ever asked Bob, hey Bob, did you kill Kathy? Or is that another one of those ones you don't want to answer?
That's one of those I don't want to answer.
I know this is tough, but I want you to think about this for a second. Forgetting about Bob for a second, Susan was your close friend, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Forgetting about Bob for a minute, do you want the person who's responsible for her death, do you want that person held accountable?
Susan told me about Bob, which was, there's nothing we can do for her now, she's gone, but he's not.
And so is the way I'm taking that, Nick, is you're kind of the same thing that Susan said about Kathy, you're now kind of saying to yourself about Susan, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, he's alive. He's not.
So it's a little bit hard to hear. What the evidence is going to show, Nick Chiavin said, is that, in essence, he didn't want to say, and he cited back to what Susan had told him about Kathy, which is, Kathy's gone, Bob's still here, we need to protect Bob. Nick Chiavin's now saying, Susan's gone, Bob's still here, we need to protect Bob.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So we're at day 3 in the DURST trial in terms of the opening statement by the prosecution. Day 3 was also when the prosecution wrapped up, that was yesterday. When Deputy District Attorney John Lewin began his opening statement, he told the court that he wasn't sure how long it was going to take, which is never a good thing. Just in terms of a narrative, it's always important if you're going to tell a story that you kind of let your audience know what they're in for, right? So that was one thing that I would be a little bit critical about. My own sort of impression of his opening was that he, obviously from a narrative point of view, it's great that he gave so much information, but from the perspective of testing the jurors' patience and also the court's patience, he really went on quite a lot, and there were quite a few things that he could have been certainly a lot more concise about. For example, he spent a lot of the last day talking about Nick Chiavin, an advertising executive, and instead of just saying this was what Nick Chiavin eventually said in court, he provided a kind of a narrative to that. And because I've been criticized in the same way, people have said, why don't you just get to the point? Just say what the hell is the point? I'm going to provide you with a little bit of insight, I guess, into why the Deputy District Attorney took as long as he did in saying what he needed to say. So in terms of Nick Chiavin, what he basically did was he provided the kind of the roller coaster ride in terms of specifically Nick Chiavin, a lifelong friend of DURST and also Susan Berman. So he was actually a mutual friend of both of theirs. And so what he did was he sort of provided kind of a roller coaster ride of the various times he'd spoken directly with Chiavin and the sort of stories or the responses Chiavin had given him each time. And then he provided the final response, basically the bottom line, which is the court testimony he gave in late 2014. So that's, 6 years ago. Sorry, that's not accurate. The court appearance was in 2017, okay, so 3 years ago, and that was talking about a dinner he had with DURST in Harlem, I believe, in late 2014. So 3 years after the dinner, he testified to what they spoke about in court, and he kind of said it was very hard for him to talk about that. So you might ask, why wouldn't the Deputy District Attorney just jump to this statement made in court? And I think that there are basically two reasons for it. I think the one reason is you're going to obviously hear from the defense, and the defense are going to want to interject. I'm talking about in the actual leading of evidence, that the defense are going to want to interject and say, well, whatever you say about Nick Chiavin, you know, on this occasion he said I didn't know, on that occasion, and that is going to confuse the jury, if that makes sense. So in other words, if the prosecutor says, well, Nick Chiavin said that, kind of in an absolute way, then the defense can kind of get up at any point and say, well, on that date he said something else, so he's not a reliable witness. So in the way that the prosecutor has contextualized the story, he's kind of making it very hard for the defense to make a case that's going to work. And what I mean is, he's kind of providing a chronological story about how one particular witness, in this case Nick Chiavin, kind of felt conflicted about saying what he knew, and didn't say everything that he knew. He said that he knew something, and the prosecutor is kind of giving his interpretation of that hesitation. He's talking about how Chiavin kind of said, you know, what is the point in saying anything about Susan Berman? You know, she's dead. Nothing he can say can bring her back. And what he wanted to do is sort of look after his other friend, which is exactly what he was doing. And then obviously the prosecutor wanted to test this guy's conscience. He was like, you know, if you forget about Bob, how would you feel knowing that what happened to your best friend? You know, don't you care about justice? And obviously he did. And so he was conflicted between his friend and what had happened to his other friend. And this is the context that the prosecutor is providing. And because he's got the flaw, he's providing this context chronologically and completely, and he kind of can't be interrupted by the defense, even though the defense tried to do that initially. I did think it was extraordinary the way that the prosecutor led so much evidence in such a detailed way over 3 days. I think he's obviously studied Dick Dagurian. He has seen how he works, and he wanted to take a chance to provide his story on his own terms, giving his own references, and that was done very well. It wasn't just him standing in front of the court telling a story. He was providing actual footage with dates and names and faces, and importantly also DURST's own words, dated, you know, according to various footage as well. So in other words, what he was saying was anchored in kind of a narrative, and I do exactly the same thing, especially in my videos. What I tell you, I try to also show you, so that what I'm saying isn't plucked out of the ether. It is based on what we know. And that is an almost impossible narrative to debunk, because it is anchored in verifiable data. The only way to debunk it, I guess, is to say, well, that journalist made a mistake in that article, or in that court appearance that subsequently happened, which made that disclosure invalid, or you know, one can't reference it anymore. And it's very seldom that sort of thing really happens. Because he's a prosecutor, he knows what he's referring to is basically on the record. It's official. You're not easily going to discount that. And so Durst's defense counsel are in for a very, very hard, basically, the prosecution's opening has basically been like a knockout blow. And I don't know how the defense are going to kind of get up out of this. I think the best option they kind of have is playing the sympathy card, saying, well, look, this guy's an old man and something, something, something. So I guess we'll see. The prosecution are also very ambitiously, all they really need to do and all that they're required to do is prove one murder, which is the murder of Susan Berman. And instead of doing that, they are accumulating the evidence against Durst and saying, well, you know, this guy's not only guilty of killing Susan Berman, he's killed other people as well. Plus, he's indicated that he wishes to Igor Douglas, which is kind of like a code word for what he wanted to do to his brother, that he also wanted to murder his brother. And then you have these very damning statements from Durst himself, who kind of said something like, not quite in these words, but he said something to the effect of, if you back me into a corner, I will kill you. And that also came up on the third day. So I'm going to play you a couple of audio clips that really are some of the highlights, and then I will come back to you and talk a little bit more about day 3.
And again, when he was presented with this idea that he doesn't kill because he enjoys killing, he did not deny the allegation.
I told my daughter, listen, Bob is somebody who, Bob doesn't kill because he enjoys killing.
That's what Cody Gonzalez says. If you back him into a corner, he'll kill you.
So Bob Durst, on his own, is repeating what a detective from Texas said about him. So, you heard the statement. I'm explaining, Bob, you're not somebody who kills because you enjoy killing. And he tells you, you back me into a corner, and I'll kill you.
So what is extraordinary about Robert Durst is how much he has implicated himself. I mean, over and over again, at various times, in various contexts, Durst has gotten himself into trouble by literally telling people what he's done. Whether it's a movie director, whether it's a friend in terms of Nick Chiavin, whether it's his other friends, whether it's a neighbor in the case of Morris Black. And so over the course of a long period of time, it might not seem like he did that very often, but if you are a good investigator, and in this case a good prosecutor, all you do is you go through that swath of time and you try and collect the various instances where he's done that. And then you put them together in a narrative, which is exactly what he's done. Now, how I would have done it was I would have provided kind of like a table of contents at the beginning of his opening statement and said, well, this is what I'm going to touch on. And it's going to deal with, first of all, that person, then that one, and this is what I'm trying to get at, something like that, just to give them a ballpark. Of course, when you do that, you're also priming the defense to know and to prepare for how to jump in, while you're presenting. So in that sense, you might not want to do that. And that is something that I noticed covering a couple of other court cases is the work of a lawyer, a criminal trial lawyer, is often to catch not only the witness on the witness stand or the defendant, if he testifies, off guard, but it's also to catch the defense counsel off guard. So you don't want to let them know what you're doing, what your strategy is, because they can mitigate it, minimize it, interrupt it, and do whatever they can to lessen its impact. And so one's got to juggle the strategy of getting information through the course of the trial, and also conveying information through the course of the trial. One's got to juggle that with wrong-footing your opposition, in this case the defense counsel, right? The problem that I've noticed that can often happen is in this little sort of chess game, to keep the other side, guessing, it sometimes confuses the court. It sometimes confuses the jury. And anything that is going to confuse the jury plays into the hands of reasonable doubt. And so I'm sometimes of the view that the prosecutor must just play their cards and let the defense do their little dance, and then just play your cards. I'm not saying play all of your cards. I'm just saying don't spend too much time holding cards back and being clever, because you might end up confusing your audience or boring them, which is even worse. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play the prosecutor's story, basically, of Nick Chiavin's story, but I'm going to play the clips back to back. And it's only going to really be about 1 minute, maybe 2 of audio. But basically what you're going to see is, or what you're going to hear, is Nick Chiavin kind of saying, giving one version of that dinner in Harlem, and then you kind of get the feeling is telling the story, he knows what happened, he is visualizing it, but he's being very selective in what he's going to reveal. In other words, he knows what the prosecutor wants, but he's not sure if he wants to give it to him. And then the prosecutor keeps kind of knocking on his door and calling, and he sort of wears down Nick Chiavin. He wears down this friend of Robert Durst, saying, you know what, do the right thing. And there's quite an interesting reference to a Band-Aid, that this advertising executive has put a Band-Aid over a scar or over a sore or over a wound that has been caused by this crime. And the prosecutor and Nick Chiavin kind of share the metaphor that, well, you've already removed 90% of the Band-Aid, you might as well remove the whole thing. Well, not quite. If Nick Chiavin had never said that little bit about Durst saying, well, you'll hear it in the clip, but if he'd never said that, then the 95% might as well be leaving the entire Band-Aid on. In terms of the 95% removed, wouldn't really count for anything. It was that last little bit that he was holding back was actually 100%, was 100% of what the prosecutor needed. But obviously it was an effective ploy to say, well, look, you've told me so much, we know what you want to say, just say it. I know you want to say it, and probably did want to say it. And one can certainly ask, what was keeping Nick Chiavin from, on the one hand you can say, jeopardizing his friendship with Durst, on the other hand you can say something else. You know, what was preventing him from doing something? What was keeping him silent? So I'm going to play you the clip, and you're going to hear him in the beginning kind of back out of his own version, and you only know that he's backing out of his own version when you hear the version afterwards, where he doesn't back out of it and is in court, and he says exactly what he means to say, and he knows what it is. It's something specific. So listen out for that.
We had dinner in Harlem, and during the dinner, he mentioned that one of the things he wanted to do is he wanted to tell me, he said, I wanted to talk to you about Kathy and Susan. He said both names in, but then we had dinner, we had a few drinks, and all of a sudden it was time to leave, and we left, we walked outside, He looked upset and he just shrugged and kind of mumbled something. I've been trying to put together what it was, and I can't really put together what it was, but he just had a resigned look on his face. Then he walked away, and I said, Bob, and he didn't turn back around. He just sort of walked. He looks like a very old man now. Anyway, he walked off. And that was that. I just took him not denying he was meaning something. I'll call you just like I did now. I mean, I've given this a lot of thought, and it's weird. The only thing that's weird to me is how you seem to know what's going on inside my mind. But I guess you've done this a lot.
My impression of you is not, your problem isn't you can't remember what Bob told you. Your problem is you're having a hard time forgetting it.
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good.
Nick Chiavin would ultimately recount in court the rest of that conversation from that dinner in Harlem in December of 2014. And this is what he said, under oath, while on the witness stand.
The dinner concluded, and it was then that as we got up to leave, I realized that we hadn't discussed the two things that he had mentioned, Kathy and Susan. I felt kind of weird that I didn't bring it up. We walked out the door. This is hard. We walked out the door, and on the sidewalk, I said, "You wanted to talk about Susan?" And Bob said, "I had to. It was her or me. I had no choice." And then he turned to walk away, and I said, "You wanted to talk about Kathy?" And he just kept walking away. Nothing more was said.
So there you have it. Durst said to his friend Nick, he said, "It was her or me," referring to Susan Berman. And if you take what it said earlier about you back me into a corner and I'll kill you, that's how he felt in terms of Susan Berman. He felt that he'd been backed into a corner. He was giving her these huge checks, and he was led to believe that she was going to talk to the cops about Kathy Durst, about Kathy Durst's death and all that kind of thing. And there's kind of an interesting thing where she apparently said to Durst that she was going to, but it was almost like she said something, it wasn't true at the time. In other words, the cops hadn't actually contacted her and said, "We want to talk to you." She basically said to him something along the lines that the cops had contacted her and wanted to talk to her, and Durst kind of said something along the lines of, "Well, sure, you can, no problem." But that's not how he felt about it. He felt panicked, he felt worried, he felt backed into a corner. And the irony is that Susan Berman apparently wasn't being completely truthful yet because the cops hadn't contacted her. The interesting thing is they did mean to contact her. And so I don't really think that there's too much of I don't think one needs to really argue about it very much. I think the fact is Durst was justified in suspecting that the cops were going to talk to Susan Berman, regardless of whether they'd said to her that they were or not. It was in the media, it was happening, it was circulating, it just hadn't been signed off yet. So you might say, was Durst wrong to kill Susan Berman in terms of his motivations, in terms of what he was led to believe? And of course, we're now in the mind of the murderer, and so what we're saying is, well, I don't think he was wrong in the sense of being afraid of the investigation, because the investigation was ramped up, and it was ramped up in the media as well. And that's something we will deal with in due course. You know, the media that came up at the time of Susan Berman's murder, kind of in November and so on, was stuff that Durst would obviously have read, and then been obviously he would have been very naturally triggered that they are on his trail again and he needs to do something about it. And we know that what he did to Susan, allegedly did to Susan, we can imagine him doing to Morris Black under the exact same circumstances, which is the prosecutor's case as well, which is he felt his back was against the wall, he felt that his cover was going to be blown, and he did feel backed into a corner with Morris Black, and so he did what he did as a kind of self-preservation. Now, I did a live last Sunday, and one of the questions that came up, and it's come up a couple of times, people will say, why has Chris Watts provided all these different versions? Why not just tell the truth the first time? Or why not stick to the same lie, or whatever it is? And although Nick Chiavin isn't a murderer, he has kept what seems to be a murderer's secret, or what may be a murderer's secret, for many years, almost 20 years. And you could kind of argue that makes him an accessory after the fact, certainly an accessory in terms of his knowledge, or what he reasonably ought to have known. And that's kind of an interesting thing on its own, but we're not going to go into that. So let me just backtrack a little bit and say Nick Chiavin isn't a murderer. But if you have to ask him that question, or if you have to present that question in terms of him and say, why did Nick Chiavin's story change, right? Then the answer is quite clear, is that first of all, he lied because he was economical with the truth, because he was trying to protect his friend, and he said something to that effect, we need to protect Bob, right? So that was what was going on. But then things change, people change. Time doesn't heal all wounds. There is an evolution of the human psyche. There's a change in the human heart over a period of time. And the prosecutor asking him again and again, and the appearance of Durst in newspapers and in the Jinx would have given him an opportunity to focus on this thing that he was trying to repress, the story that he was trying to forget about, this thing that he didn't want to deal with. And so by being confronted again and again and again, he's forced to bring this thing that is pushed below the surface, is forced to bring it closer and closer to the surface. And so eventually when he's in court, he finally tells the truth, and he says, this is what Bob Durst does, thus implicating Bob Durst in a very serious implication. It's basically a very close friend of Durst telling the court at the time in 2017 that Durst admitted to killing their mutual best friend. Now, obviously, when you understand this whole process, it's understandable. It's understandable that the versions, I wouldn't say evolved, just that they were somewhat limited in the beginning, and then they were expanded upon, and finally the truth was revealed. So pieces of the truth were given, and then progressively greater pieces of the truth, and then finally the essential piece that was missing. So when you associate something like that with Chris Watts, the thing is, he's giving you the least that he feels that he can get away with, right? He's trying to tell you the least that he can tell you that is going to satisfy you and that you're going to kind of leave him alone and leave him in peace. And in a way, Nick Chiavin was doing the same thing. He was trying to manage his relationships with other people. He was trying to kind of juggle everything, kind of a whole host of dynamics, and maintain some kind of peace of mind with himself as well. And it's a very interesting situation that's going on here, because he obviously has a friendship, the legacy of a friendship with somebody else that has died, and now someone else has been murdered. But it's being presented in this case that it was his friend murdering another friend of his, and the way he reasoned was, well, the friend that is dead is dead. There's nothing I can say or do that's going to bring her back, which seems a little bit convenient to me.
Susan told me about Bob, which was, there's nothing we can do for her now, she's gone, but he's not.
And so it's the way I'm taking that, Nick, is you're kind of the same thing that Susan said about Kathy, you're now kind of saying to yourself about Susan, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, he's alive. He's not.
So it's a little bit hard to hear. What the evidence is going to show, Nick Chiavin said, is that, in essence, he didn't want to say, and he cited back to what Susan had told him about Kathy, which is, Kathy's gone, Bob's still here, we need to protect Bob. Nick Chiavin's now saying, Susan's gone, Bob's still here, we need to protect Bob.
Which seems a little bit convenient to me. It seems a little bit of a hand-wringing to do something like that. So that really concludes the marathon opening by the Deputy District Attorney. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I think there was certainly a heck of a lot of interesting disclosures made on the very last day. In terms of Patreon, the next live I'll be doing will be dealing with the psychology of Chris Watts, specifically the link that self-esteem plays in the Watts case. This puzzle piece hasn't really been discussed. I can't really remember anyone talking about Chris Watts' self-esteem. And so that's something we're going to be talking about. I also want to talk about ego in an upcoming episode on Patreon. Ego and self-esteem are similar, but they're not the same thing. And so we're going to be going into that psychology in a very deep way over the next 2 Sundays. That'll be 10 Eastern Standard Time or 5 p.m., 1700 hours, SAST. You can check that out online, what time that is in your time zone. And that'll be on Patreon. And then I'll also be coming back to Vincent van Gogh and talking about the accidental death as depicted in the 60 Minutes episode, but also in Naife and Smith's book, Van Gogh, The Life. So I'm going to just be taking you through that. And I also want to compare the accidental shooting with Morris Black to Van Gogh, and just show you how absurd the idea of an accidental shooting is. Accidental shootings don't happen very often in sort of non-criminal contexts. So if you have 2 innocent people, you don't typically have accidental shootings where you have a gun kind of in the mix and then someone gets shot. So what I'm trying to say is you don't get accidental shootings. They are often the result of somewhere along the line is a criminal element. I mean, why is someone carrying a gun in the first place? So thank you for listening. If you're interested in further coverage of the DURST trial, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.